Hey folks, David Stewart here. Let's talk a little bit about plot and something very specific having to do with plots, what I call plot goals. Yes, I'm finally talking about plot in a Storycraft video. Very frequently, people are asking me to do more videos on plot, talk about plot structure, how to execute plot, and I'm hesitant to give out a lot of specific advice for a couple of reasons. The first one is that I think it's a little bit anti-creative if I tell you that this is the thing that you have to do in a plot. I think a lot of creativity has to do with how you plan out the event sequence of a story and what events happen in what order, which is what I consider the plot. So I don't want to give too many prescriptions for how things ought to be done, because you may think of a new way of doing it, and that's creative and valid and good. I tend to think just in terms of effect. You do this, it has this effect. Is that the effect that you want? The other reason is that if you have a prescription like, you have to write a 3-act story for a movie, then you may take a story that doesn't fit that structure and kind of cram it in there, cut stuff out that needs to be part of the story that's kind of endemic to the feeling of the story. Every story has a different length, has a different feeling to it, has a different kind of focus, different strengths depending on what media you're in, whether you're doing comics or a novel or a movie, and those things should be recognized and not be forced into some predetermined plot structure because other movies have that particular format. The format of your story is dependent on what that story is, and a big part of what makes the story what it is this concept of plot goals. Whether you're writing for comics or books or movies or stage or whatever you're doing with your story, plot goal is always there, and that is an essential element of a book. What is a plot goal? Well, a plot goal is a desired outcome. It can be anything, and it can be desired by either the audience or the protagonists, usually both, because you want the protagonists to be trying to achieve a plot goal, but not always, and I can talk about that in a minute. So if you think of any kind of example, you think of Star Wars. What's the main plot goal of Star Wars? What's the goal? What's the thing that people want to have happen? Well, they want the Death Star to be destroyed, and the entire structure of the movie is derived from this main plot goal of we got to blow up the Death Star. What's the plot goal of Lord of the Rings? It's destroy Sauron's ring. What's the plot goal of To Kill a Mockingbird? Well, it's to get Tom Robinson off. Now, that example is very important because in Star Wars, you achieve the plot goal. In To Kill a Mockingbird, that plot goal of saving Tom Robinson fails. So plot goals aren't always achieved in stories, and in some cases, it's better if they're not achieved. It changes the feeling of the story, and it's important for certain stories for the plot goals to not be achieved. Usually with a tragedy, the plot goals, at least of the protagonists, are often unfulfilled. You can think of Romeo and Juliet or any kind of Shakespearean tragedy. It's about setting up a plot goal, and then that plot goal fails. The tragedy of Julius Caesar, you have Brutus fighting this rebellion, and it fails at the end. Spoiler alert for a very old piece of drama. So what leads up to that main plot goal and determines its failure or success, that's really the meat of your story. Now, you have a plot goal like blow up the Death Star, and then you have a bunch of things that stand in the way of you achieving that plot goal. And those tend to be the events that are moving you closer to the plot, to the end of the story and the goal of the plot, or are inhibiting characters' progress towards the end of the story and the goal of the plot. So you can think of these as plot points on the way. And within a plot with a large plot goal, you can have subplots. Subplots have separate plot goals. Sometimes those plot goals contribute to the main plot goal. Other times those plot goals are independent. So a typical movie would include an A, B, and a C story. So the A story is the main plot goal that's established early in the movie, in the first act, and usually in the exposition. And the earlier the plot goal is really described and identified, usually the more tension you're putting into the movie and the more attention you're able to grab from people. So you have a plot goal, and then you have a B story that's usually like a romance, and then you have a C story, which is something that helps resolve the A and B story and move you into the third act, where you have a bunch of final action that's able to finally either achieve the plot goal or cause failure with the plot goal. You don't have to use that particular structure, but that's the way a lot of movies are written. So your A story, the plot goal, like if you imagine a story with a guy, like maybe you're going to make a movie about a guy who's going to see his dying father because his dying father wants to give away his fortune, and he never knew his father. So he makes a journey to meet his father. That's the A story, is is, am I going to actually reconcile with my father? And for what reasons will I reconcile with him? Am I going to do it to get the inheritance money, or am I going to meet this man that I never knew, and will it complete my life, and will it give me, what will it give me emotionally? You might have a B story. He meets the nurse of his father, his dying father, and he has attraction to her. So the B story is a love story. And maybe that B story helps resolve the character's emotions about the failure of the A story. Maybe at the end of the movie, you have a C story. You have kids that this main character didn't know about, and they're coming in to try to get the inheritance money and make the father like sign a new will. So you have a bunch of tension that adds up at the end and kind of resolves everything. And maybe the character decides, I didn't care about the money. I cared more about knowing my father, and the nurse secretly helps him and prevents him from actually signing the will, or shreds it somehow, so he ends up with the money even though he didn't want it. That might be like an interesting little tight resolution with an A, B, and a C story. But each of those has a little bit separate goal. You have the C story would be an antagonist goal. We want to take the money. And the B story would be, I want to get the girl, and the A story would be, I want to reconcile with my father. And maybe some of those fail, like obviously you want the antagonist's C story there to fail. Antagonists can have their own plot goals. In fact, Empire Strikes Back, going back to Star Wars, the plot goals are all about the antagonists. And what was interesting about Revenge of the Sith, Episode 3, is that you had this extra final act that was about all the protagonists all failed, and then the plot goals of the antagonists were succeeding in the final act. So that's really what I think of with plot goals. Now, you may have heard this word conflict thrown around. What's the conflict of the story? I don't like to think when I'm trying to think of event sequence, I don't like to think of conflict necessarily, because conflict, you usually think about people arguing with each other, people not getting along, people fighting against something. And not all stories have a conflict that's direct and in your face like that. You may have a story about a guy with one leg learning to run so that he can complete a marathon. Plot goal is, I want to complete a marathon. What's the thing that's holding him back is he's out of shape, or he has one leg. He has to learn to overcome all of these obstacles in order to finally reach the plot goal. What's his conflict? Like, what's he in conflict with? Well, I guess he's in conflict with his own limitations, but we don't usually think about like fighting our own limitations as if they're an actual antagonist. It's more about a goal and obstacles that prevent that goal. And I think that's a more helpful way to think about it, at least when you're doing event sequence. When you're thinking about the way a protagonist and an antagonist interact, of course, conflict is a big part of that. But when you're just thinking about event sequences and obstacles, conflict doesn't necessarily have to be a part of that. So sometimes people say, well, where's the opening conflict for the story? It's like, where are you establishing the plot goal? Where are you establishing the main goal of the film? Now, I mentioned you can have plot goals fail. To Kill a Mockingbird's a great example. You have this plot goal. Certainly the main protagonists want this guy, Tom, to get off, to not be convicted of a crime he didn't commit. And it becomes more and more clear that he didn't commit the crime, but there's a high degree of uncertainty because we don't know what the jury's thinking, and we think the jury might convict him. And indeed, the jury does convict him. There's a failure of the plot goal, which then sets in motion an extra act of the book, which is about the fact that even though that plot goal failed, it still created a conflict with the father of the accuser. And he becomes a bad guy. He becomes an antagonist, a villain. And that last part of the book is about how the plot goals have shifted away from something that ended up failing to being something defensive, that an antagonist ends up having a set of plot goals, and how you end up reacting to his failure on those or his success on those becomes the real meat of the end of that particular story. So plot goals don't always have to succeed, and indeed, you usually want a couple of them to fail because that makes a more interesting story, a story that can go in different directions. If the protagonist is just be able to barrel through all obstacles towards the main goal, that's something that a Mary Sue tends to do, not something that a legitimate and interesting protagonist tends to do. So that's really what I like to think about with plot, is what is your plot goal and how are you going to inhibit your goals to there. Another way that you can have subplots, I mentioned you could have subplots that contribute to the main plot. If you imagine a format like The Hobbit, all right, The Hobbit, the goal is we're going to go try to steal as much treasure as we can from this dragon. And that's like way at the end, and there's this epic journey on the way. Each chapter of the book represents a different small plot goal and a different obstacle towards reaching that main plot goal of the dragon. So you have, you run into some trolls, and the trolls are going to eat you. And who's going to save us from the trolls? Oh, Gandalf saves us from the trolls. Okay, so our plot goal of not being eaten by the trolls was successful, but the trolls were an obstacle. We get captured by goblins in the mountains. The goblins like eat the ponies. Now we have a bigger obstacle towards reaching our goal because we don't have our pack animals, and we're hungry, and we're alone, and then the wolves are chasing us. Right, so each chapter focuses on this obstacle and this danger that's being imposed upon the party trying to reach their ultimate plot goal. So each little chapter has its own little plot goal, and that's another way that you can think of plot goals and subplots, is that each obstacle, you have to have a goal to reach that, and then you have to have some way to get around that obstacle, to overcome that obstacle. And if you're thinking of The Hobbit, then it's like Gandalf does some magic and they run away, and then Bilbo, as another little subplot, gets the ring and has to use that to escape. You get tied up by spiders at one point. You have to figure out how to get out of that. Oh, well, Bilbo has a magic ring. He'll use that to to distract the spiders and lead them away, while the other dwarves cut open the spider silk and free them. How are we going to get out of this prison? We'll put you in barrels, and so each obstacle towards the goal has some solution that helps the party to get through it. And the format of The Hobbit, and I think this is one of the reasons that the movies always felt very awkward, is the format of The Hobbit, it doesn't fit like a movie format very well. It's like a series of adventures that lead to one big plot goal. And then, of course, after we get to the end, there's another level of plot goals that get announced essentially as a result. So there's a consequence to the success of the plot, which becomes the Battle of the Five Armies, which brings about tragedy and triumph in the same thing. So that's a great one to look at, that the format doesn't fit what people normally today think of as the way a plot ought to be structured. But it's really better because of it. And a lot of your favorite books probably don't fit what a lot of script doctors would say is a proper way to format a script. Godfather 2 is a great example. It just doesn't fit what normally is considered a proper screenplay format at all. It's got this different time differential stuff and two different characters, two different kind of goals going on. It's a very different kind of way of structuring the movie, and it's better because of it. It's more interesting because of it. So I'm hesitant to give prescriptions. You need a goal, and it's up to you as a creative person to figure out what obstacles am I going to place in the way, and what solutions am I going to offer. What's the interesting solutions people are going to come up with, my characters are going to come up with, in order to finally achieve the success of the plot goal. So hopefully that's an interesting introduction to the idea of plot goals. Do the protagonists always have to have a plot goal that's the same as the audience? And the answer is actually no. I was just thinking of this example. This is a frequent trope in romantic comedies, which is two characters want somebody, right? So one character wants this girl, and this girl, and a different girl wants a different guy, but it's set up so that the audience really wants this guy and this girl to actually get together. And so the characters have different plot goals from the audience. The audience wants a desired outcome. The characters want a different desired outcome because the audience sees that, oh, these two are so perfect for each other. Why can't they just get together? And then the characters have various difficulties with the person they're pursuing, the person they're trying to date. And then they finally, at the end of the romantic comedy, end up with the person that they're supposed to be with. And the resolution of the conflict, if you will, the achieving of the goal is from the audience's perspective the correct one, but it wasn't initially from the protagonist's perspective the correct one. And of course, those goals can change whenever you're writing a story halfway along the way. It's up to you how you want to do that. So thanks so much for watching. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe, and let me know what you want to see and what you want to hear. Think of some of your favorite movies, and probably right away you'll think of, oh, there's a primary and forceful goal, and all the stuff that happens leading up to that goal is really the meat of the story. That's the event sequence. And now you can think of, I don't know, there's so many to think of. You can think of Terminator 2, how the the goal shifts from survival to acting and being a warrior. So this is a midpoint shift that happens a lot in hero's journey type stories, where you go from running away as your main goal to I'm going to fight back and achieve something meaningful as your main goal. So that's something that you can see a lot in hero's journey kind of stuff. It goes from escape to conquering. And you can see that in Star Wars. It goes from we got to escape the Empire and get the plans to the rebellion to now we need to actually really blow up the Death Star. We need to turn and fight. So anyway, I thought I'd throw those examples in at the end. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.